Africa has been the focus of four out of every five UN security resolutions over the past decade, yet the continent still has no permanent seat at the table. As African leaders gather for the African Union summit in Addis Ababa, aid agency Oxfam is calling for urgent reform of the Security Council, warning that decisions shaping Africa's peace and security are being made without African representation. To discuss this, we're joined on the line by Elise Nalbandian, who's Oxfam's African Union Office Liaison. Elise, thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, Asanda. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. I mean, Africa dominates the agenda when it comes to the UN Security Council, yet we have no permanent seat. Why is it important that we talk about this, particularly at this point in time, as well as with leaders meeting at the AU summit in Addis Ababa?
It's always been important that we talk about this, of course, because the United Nations Security Council is vitally important, but it is dangerously illegitimate. As Oxfam's executive director said, the P5, that's the powerful five countries with the veto power, assumed a role in a colonial era that has long passed, but the institution remains in that moment. It has not yet changed. It hasn't actually given up its powers. Indeed, Africa makes up 28% of the UN membership and is the subject of more than 80% of the resolutions on protracted crises. 354 out of 437 resolutions on protracted crises are on the African continent itself. Yet it remains the only region fully excluded from permanent membership. This is not an oversight. That's the problem. It is a deliberate preservation of the system designed to concentrate power in former colonial capitals. That's why it matters.
Right. And Oxfam is arguing that decisions that are taken in New York don't reflect what's happening on the ground on our continent. What gets lost when African voices are missing from these critical conversations?
What gets lost, what we miss, is accountability, context, and lived reality of the people who are actually on the ground itself. It's a bunch of diplomats in New York who don't really have a connection to the people on the ground. And there is the A3, the three African countries in the Security Council, the non-permanent members. But how often do they get listened to? They have themselves in the past expressed frustrations of being listened to. There are examples, I'm not going to go into examples now, but in Oxfam's report from 2024 called Vetoing Humanity, and if you look at the annex that we just wrote, which is called No Representation, No Peace, we actually also argue that the systems are built to concentrate the power up there. And there's the penholder system and so on and so forth, which are all a continuation of the colonial legacy. This is not representation. This is paternalism dressed as procedure. African society leaders were very, very clear in 2024 during the Summit of the Future when they said that genuine reform means African voices should be the ones shaping the peace mandates, for example. That is vitally important, and yet how often are we sure that the African voices are heard? Not just consulted, they have to shape them. Without that, the council remains a tool for managing instability rather than building justice. So the council is vitally important if it works, and we need it to work. That's it.
Right, and on that point, I mean, if we look at last year, many of the Council's resolutions on Africa involved either sanctions or military action. But, I mean, we see that that didn't really yield the results that it needed to. So, what would a more effective measure be in bringing lasting peace then?
I mean, resolutions are not peace. They're pieces of paper, and they're important pieces of paper when they are implemented. And yet, Oxfam, for example, found that while the Security Council adopted 79 resolutions on Sudan and South Sudan and 53 on Somalia in the past decade, it's the same time period I'm talking about, humanitarian needs and your next speaker will talk about this, so I won't actually go into that. Humanitarian needs in those countries have nearly quadrupled in the same decade. In the DRC, despite 25 resolutions over a decade, the MONUSCO mission, for example, was chronically underfunded and uncoordinated. One might even call it set up to fail. When a resolution passes but lacks enforcement, adequate resources or a credible exit strategy um, are also not there, it's not a solution. It's not going to bring peace. So when we do pass a resolution, we have to mean it. We have to live with it. We have to live by it, and we have to implement it. And that's not always the case. It is a performance of action that allows the council to claim it has done something while the bomb continues to fall. So resolutions on their own don't bring peace. Sanctions on their own don't bring peace.
Yeah. Many African leaders have backed the Ezulwini consensus on Security Council reform. So, what's stopping that position from translating into real change?
Yes, the Zulwini consensus is 20 years old. Well, it's 21 this year. And it has some very sensible demands there. It demands 2 permanent African seats with full veto powers. It demands also several other things. But nearly 20 years later, there is no agreement on who should occupy these seats. Africa is its worst enemy on this one. We have an Africa that is divided on this issue. They agree we need permanent seats, but everyone wants it for themselves. So, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, big countries who have a level of power and could actually do the job are the usual contenders, but there is no continental consensus supporting any one of them. Meanwhile, the P5 offer rhetoric without teeth. They say things like, well, we'll support the permanent membership without the veto power, and so on and so forth. The verbal support is there for Africa, but if you notice, there is no actual written agreement that we can negotiate on. It's all very much up in the air. And why would the P5 be interested in reform when the status quo is benefiting them quite so much, right? So
Right.
for
If we had one
Oxfam
solid
and
message from Africa, what do you think that message would be that Africa wants the Security Council, if they were listening, to hear today?
well, the message is not new. It's not complicated. In fact, it's what Africa's been saying since the decolonial era. Um, and of course, whatever we say now, it's not optional for a better future. How can one conceive that a continent with 1.4 billion people, who are the youngest people on the planet, have no voice in the decisions that determine its destiny? We are the continent which have this many people and most of the young people as well. So we have a long-term view on everything. Africa is not asking for a seat at a broken table. We want to rebuild the table, and that's what we should be doing. That also means we need to abolish the veto. We need to end some of the systemic bureaucracies inside the United Nations Security Council, which limit Africa's voice, like the penholder system. We need to cancel the debts and reform the global financial architecture that extracts 30 billion an hour from the global south to the north. And we need to really seriously talk about the reparations agenda, not as symbolism, but as a structural redress for centuries of extraction and exploitation.
Elise, thank you so much for your time. We'll leave it there, and we value your insights.
Thank you, Asunda.
That's Elise Nalbandian, who is Oxfam's African Union Office Liaison, speaking to us about Africa's exclusion from the UN Security Council and calls for reform as leaders gather for the African Union Summit that's happening in Addis Ababa.